Rich, did you hear the news that dropped today?
I did not. What's going on?
I guess that's a pretty open-ended question, but the news that I'm referring to is that Nintendo Switch is officially bringing back Perfect Dark, and they're doing it via online multiplayer. So if any of you guys are Nintendo 64 players and you once played Perfect Dark, you will be able to play Perfect Dark once again on Nintendo Switch. And I figure this is the perfect time to bring up that Perfect Dark is just a better version of GoldenEye.
I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years. But there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have. And I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest. And I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro.
Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson. I love Perfect Dark, and I am joined by my co-host, Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, buddy?
You know, it's funny. You had Josh Norris on one of your first episodes of, I think it was Perspectives. It was Perspectives this summer. And he was talking about how he would sit and watch his brother play a lot of video games. And I had the exact same experience growing up because I have one sibling, my older brother. He's 5 years older than me. And my job, JJ, no joke, was to sit and read through the manual and the tips and tricks and to just tell him what to do. Like, I was the offensive coordinator of him playing Banjo-Kazooie. That was my job.
So here's the thing. I have a brother who's 6 years older than me, or 7 years older than me, like 6.5 years older. And I would do the same thing, but he was a PlayStation guy. And so I would mostly do it for like Tomb Raider and stuff like that, right? But then I was the N64 guy. He never really got into N64, so like that was my thing. And so when it comes to gaming, especially retro gaming, anything Nintendo 64 related, I feel like I'm in like the 98th percentile in terms of like being good at the system, but also knowledge of that system. Other systems, you know, like I have an Xbox S right now. People are so much better than me at gaming with other systems, but when it comes to Nintendo 64, Rich, that's my jam.
Yeah, I had a sweet mate, same thing, that on Mario Kart, he would just hop his way through Rainbow Road and people would like bet him beers or whatever, and he would just wreck them every single time.
I won't throw out the take that Diddy Kong Racing is a better version than Mario Kart. That's not, look, I had this conversation with a buddy actually like 2 days ago, okay? Perfect Dark is a literal enhanced version of GoldenEye. It's like, take the GoldenEye core game and make it better. Like there's bots that you can play against in multiplayer mode. There's more maps, there's more guns. It's just a better version of that game. Whereas Diddy Kong Racing and Mario Kart 64, they're two very different, like gameplay wise, very, very different.
And once you start bringing in the flying and stuff like that, things get a little weird.
Yeah. My take more so is that Diddy Kong Racing is underrated. That's the take. It's not that, because I think Mario Kart 64 has stood the test of time very well. Like, you can still play that game and enjoy yourself, right? Try to play GoldenEye right now. It's horrible. GoldenEye is terrible right now. Mario Kart 64 you can still play. Diddy Kong Racing you can still play. And hopefully on the Switch, Perfect Dark, you'll still be able to play. Anyway, did you see the Puppy 2 dropped? I
did. The head of product, I forget her name, but you put it in Discord last night as a teaser, and then launched today. I've got a deposit ready to go, and then I'm going to fire a bunch of those. I think I have like a dozen slow drafts going right now. We'll probably add like 12 to 20 more. And then, I think I like this slow burn of working on some of the smaller drafts and just learning things that I like, some roster construction and stacks that I enjoy putting together. And then I'm going to start to ramp up some more BBMs because, like you, I mean, I'm even further down in the learning process than you are. I feel like I'm an extension of the audience coming this with brand new eyes to everything. So I saw the puppy dropped. And are you max entered yet? Or are you close?
I'm not. No, I'm not. I entered probably 20 whenever it first dropped, and then I'll probably maybe tonight enter 10 to 20 more, and then just kind of see how things go. I think, like last puppy, I probably got like 40 in or something like that. It's harder to max enter, some of these contests, because obviously entry fee is $5 instead of $25 for Best Ball Mania. And so it's just going to naturally fill pretty quick because more people are going to want to enter and play. And so it's just more difficult to get the full 150 in there. And I don't really want to have 300 slow drafts going on at once, by max entering that. With the draft guide that I'm trying to finish, I'll be going on vacation over the 4th of July. This is not the time to, have 300 slow drafts going at once. But yeah, I'm going to be involved. I'm already in some drafts and ended up getting the 101 in a lot of them once again. So I'm kind of like going back and forth with CeeDee Lamb, Christian McCaffrey, because I just don't want to have too much exposure to CMC there.
Well, it's interesting that you're going back and forth there, because one of your biggest focus that you list here as we get into specific strategy this week is that you feel like you're going 0 RB a little bit too much. So give us your experience of, you say, drafting too many wide receivers sometimes and finding yourself trying to scrounge for RBs. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Look, I think that every draft has its own sort of unique market. Now, you're going to see more unique markets in season long, where you go from your home league to a neighborhood league to a league maybe with sharper people. And not to say that like those home leagues and neighborhood leagues can't be sharp, but every sort of economy is going to be different with each of those leagues. Now, on Underdog, they're all a lot tighter and closer because we're all working off of the same ADP and it's the same general rules and stuff like that. Now, but I will say, like, from contest to contest, things do differ. I mean, like, I've been doing the marathon drafts. I mentioned that last week a little bit. I haven't liked them as much personally. Other people love them more, and this is just a personal preference. I would still check it out if you haven't checked it out. But it's a season long format. You're getting scored based on what happened throughout the entire season. And I get frustrated while drafting in those drafts because people stray away from ADP a little bit more, and I'm not used to that. And they're getting, quarterbacks maybe a round or two before they typically get drafted. And then I'm stuck with, either a 3 QB build that I don't really like, or, a 2 QB build where that second quarterback isn't correlated or doesn't look very strong, right? And so all of these drafts are different in one way or another. Even within the same contest. Like if you get into a puppy, there's going to be some puppy drafts that are very, very wide receiver heavy just based on the other 11 teams that are in that draft with you. And there are going to be some where the wide receivers are getting drafted later than usual, right? And the same thing happens with BBM. But I would say in general, BBM is probably a little bit more wide receiver heavy than some of these other drafts are. And I think a lot of it is people who are doing BBM probably are a little bit more into the best ball scene, into Underdog, especially right now in June. And so because of that, they kind of understand what the meta is and going 0 RB and forcing wide receiver and all that kind of stuff. Whereas, the puppy might get some people who haven't really been involved with best ball this year, and they walk into the draft room and they're like, why would I take Michael Pittman ahead of Derrick Henry? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't, not to say that I would even do that, but like, why am I taking even Devontae Smith over Derrick Henry, Right. And then they see that. And so they draft running back instead. And what that means is that me, who's doing a lot of these drafts and is very used to these like wide receiver heavy drafts, I end up just getting the value at wide receiver, quote unquote value. And then once the 6th, 7th round hits, I realize I have 5 wide receivers on my team already. And now I'm definitely going with a 0 RB build, which is fine. But so many of those teams just kind of look alike, right? Like it's just the same roster construction over and over again. And I need to differentiate a little bit more. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to, like with these slow drafts especially, it's kind of hard to do in a fast draft, is to take a step back and read the draft. It's not as easy to do that. Now in fast drafts, I talk about this with our guest today, Pete Overzet. In fast drafts, you might get some unique values that fall because people are panicking and they just don't know what to do. But in fast drafts, it's also harder for you yourself to sort of like take a step back, bird's eye view this draft and say, hey, wide receivers are going later than they typically do or something like that. And so what I'm trying to do now is be more okay with drafting some of those round 4 to 6 guys, those 4 to 6 running backs, at times at ADP. Like my general rule has been from Josh Jacobs to about, into that like Joe Mixon range, Kenneth Walker range even. I'm mostly just drafting those running backs when they fall a few spots in ADP, because they will inevitably. But now, because I'm seeing, especially in the non-BBM drafts, I'm not doing that as frequently, or I'm trying not to do it as frequently, because I just get stuck with these 0 RB builds every time that I do that, right? And I think it's important to like understand the kind of environment that you're walking into whenever you're doing these drafts. So I wouldn't be that surprised if some of these puppies, like I end up going a little bit more running back heavy than I probably would in like a BBM.
I'll tell you what, anecdotally, I always feel the best when I walk away from a draft with some sort of hero RB build for that reason. Because I just have this anchor who I believe in and I know can score a ton of points. Don't even feel like they need to be correlated as much in week 17 because they have such a potential for high scoring output regardless of whoever's around them. And I just feel that it's just the vibes are way better when I have a hero RB build. And you said a couple weeks ago you have a Jalen Waddle problem. I have a different Jalen problem, and that's a Jalen Warren problem, because I always find myself in round 8 staring down the barrel of Ramondre, Zamir, DeAndre, and I'm just like, Jalen Warren, I love the player. I love the ambiguity in the backfield. It hurts though, because I do agree that I think the Najee hate has gone way, way, way too far. And we can see it. These values are right next to each other. So I have been clicking some Najee, but I just love the player. People know I'm a Jets fan. But when I squint and watch Jalen Warren, I see some Curtis Martin in him. Like, there's nothing amazing about him. There's no speed burst that's amazing. He's just always making the right play, finding the right hole, making one guy miss every single time. And he just reminds me of Curtis so much, and I love the player. So I have a Jalen Warren problem right now, JJ.
Yeah, look, I've been drafting both those guys a good bit. Najee to me is safer in my opinion between the two, and I've gone that way, I think maybe a little bit more frequently whenever I'm going 0 RB. I don't know what my exposure numbers look like for both of those players. I'm drafting them a lot. It's an ambiguous backfield. It's a run heavy offense. It's one that probably will be better than it was last year. But we know where the volume is going, and then we know that there's that contingent upside with both of those players. And so the thing with the hero RB build though, like if you are able to get even an Achane, let's say, as your anchor, even a Derrick Henry. I think Derrick Henry is not that bad of a pick right now, which is not something that I've said historically about Derrick Henry, and he's burned me over and over and over again. Last year, not as much, but he's definitely burned me throughout my fantasy football career because he is someone who breaks math consistently, right? This year, I think he's in a unique position despite being an older running back, where the weekly upside is very evident for Henry. And so I'm fine with going with Henry and using him as an anchor, for instance. I think at the end of this is a take that I haven't really thrown out there, but I think at the end of the offseason and when we get into August, I would not be shocked if I have Derrick Henry ranked ahead of Kyren Williams in my general rankings. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but there's a lot of stuff that I've been researching for the draft guide that points to Kyren being kind of a fade. Now I'm getting some exposure just because, I want some exposure. I'm going to be underweight with Kyren though versus the market this year. There's no doubt. But Derrick Henry, I think, is just a little bit more intriguing given the offense and what we know he can do. But regardless of all that, whenever you don't get that anchor running back, and let's even throw like some of the fourth round, like a Pacheco or an ETN in there,
right?
As an example, right? Like if I don't get that player, the one thing that is a little bit frustrating is if I don't get him and then I'm looking in like the 9th, 10th, 11th round for my running backs, if I don't like pound the running back position in those rounds, I'm talking like over and over and over again, then you go late and you're in like round 15, 16, 17, and you have to force the issue. Absolutely. And your builds end up being 7 running back builds. Like you need at least 6 if you're going to go 0 RB like that. And that's, there is some advantage to not having to do that. Like I'm fine with at times just having a 5 running back build with Bijan or, some RB1 and then getting like a mid-range, 1 or 2 of those mid-range guys, like a Najee Harris, Javonte Williams or something like that. And then kind of throwing some darts at those rookies, in that round 14 range and just settling at 5 and hoping that RB1 that I drafted early as the anchor, the hero, could really just be the week in, week out play in that RB1 spot, right? And then you're just kind of rotating the RB2 hypothetically. The problem though is that with zero RB, again, if you don't like relentlessly go after the position when you're in that like round 9 to 12 range, you really can find yourself in a rough position at the running back spot where your RB5 is Deontay Foreman, and that's not a really fun place to be.
Yeah. And then what hurts right now, too, is that two of the bigger red flags, I think, are in the mid to late round at running back with Jonathan Brooks. Now, it sounds like he's going to miss the start of training camp, which we already knew coming off the knee injury that it might take some time. But bad news is bad news, and we're starting to see him slip in ADP. And then Nick Chubb as well. News hasn't been great on Nick Chubb. He slipped about 7 picks over the last couple of weeks. So these mid-round guys that we want to bank on, rookie running back with that was great in the Zap model. Nick Chubb, we've seen him do it before in an offense that has a ton of upside. It's hard to plant our flags in them when they have red flags showing. Players you've been drafting, let's get into it. Speaking of some Ravens here. We were talking about Derrick Henry. The other time I feel great, JJ, is when I walk away with a Kelsey Mahomes stack or a Lamar Mark Andrews stack. I love those two, and I just can forget about those positions and just pound receiver and running back. And you've been drafting a lot of Mark Andrews.
I have, yeah. I talked to Overzet about this as well when we talk about some of the tight ends, but Andrews has just been an easy click for me. I mean, you can get him often in the 5th round, and something that I actually did. So I live streamed I guess it was a mini Schnauzer draft last week whenever I was going to do a Best Ball Mania, but I live streamed it over on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@lateroundff. And I live streamed that draft. And in that draft, so Lamar's ADP is higher than Mark Andrews' ADP, right? Whenever you're looking at the app, like Lamar is listed ahead of Mark Andrews, but I'm drafting Mark Andrews ahead of Lamar every single time because the two positions that usually don't fall in drafts at the top of drafts are wide receiver and tight end. The positions that do fall are quarterback and running back. And so what happens is, I think Lamar's ADP is higher than Andrews because of the Zay Flowers effect, where at the end of the third, and let's say at the end of the third, a team gets Zay and they want to stack them, so they get Lamar, right? So Lamar is getting drafted well above Mark Andrews in those scenarios because Mark Andrews is usually like a 4 or 5 turn guy. But if that Zay Flowers team does not get Lamar Jackson, then no other team is really like hyped to get Lamar in that 4th round range. And so what happens is, you can get Mark Andrews in the 4th, like let's say you have a front half pick, you can get him at like, if you're like in the 4, if you're in like the 104 spot, you can get Mark Andrews in the 4th. And oftentimes Lamar Jackson's going to then be there in the 5th for you. And so that stack is really gettable right now, in my opinion, whenever you play it that way instead of playing it by ADP, because a lot of teams that don't have Lamar Jackson will still get Mark Andrews, because I'm one of those teams. Like I do that all the time, right? Like you don't need Lamar Jackson to get Mark Andrews, but if you're going to get Lamar Jackson and not have a lock to get Zay Flowers or Mark Andrews, then you're stacking him with Rashad Bateman, and you don't feel as good about what that Baltimore stack is really bringing you. So I've been getting a lot of Mark Andrews for that reason. I like the game theory and the stacking behind that, but I'm also getting Andrews because I do think, and I'm doing research about this in the draft guide, talk about it a little bit in my interview with Overzet, but I do think the elite tight ends are just I say elite, the high-end tight ends.
What does elite mean to you, JJ?
Yeah, right. The high-end tight ends are very much an advantage right now. And I would not be surprised if in late July, early August, a lot of these tight ends are going earlier than they're currently going because people are realizing that they're just cheaper. I think that it really comes down to Travis Kelce kind of having a down year last year. He was still the tight end 1 in PPR points per game, but he had a down year last year, and now there's a lot of ambiguity at the top. Like you have these aging pieces in Kelce. Maybe you want to put Andrews in that, but then you have these younger guys who haven't really proven it over an entire season, like a Kincaid, like a McBride, like a Laporta. And I think that uncertainty is causing the tight ends to go later than they typically gone. And look, this isn't just a best ball thing. If you look at Fantasy Pros rankings right now and you look at tight ends, every tight end slot 1 to 6 is going later than their average ADP from 2014 to 2023. All of these tight ends are going later than they typically go. And I think a lot of that is not necessarily about their ceiling, but it's about the ambiguity in their floor, right? It's about what they might do to your team if they end up busting, which some of them will bust, but that's not the way that we should be playing fantasy football, in my opinion. And it's definitely not the way that we should be playing best ball in fantasy football.
And late round tight end seems less appealing last year. Again, this is a topic that's been discussed on the show. There isn't that crop of rookies. There isn't that group of young athletic dudes where we're just betting on athleticism and hoping they get opportunity.
And someone's going to emerge probably because that's what we see every single year. Like there are more, I always compare tight end to quarterback because they're both onesie positions. It's a lot easier to kind of wrap your head around it. There are more free agents / very late round tight ends who emerge and become like top 6 options than there are at quarterback because we just have a better idea of what quarterbacks are going to be playing all season long, right? Like Jake Ferguson, by the way, I mean, Ferguson was in the late round draft guide as a late round dart throw last year, just for the record. But a guy like Jake Ferguson comes out of nowhere, right? Like from a, like the masses standpoint, from consensus standpoint, comes out of nowhere. That kind of thing happens pretty frequently at tight end. And I think it will happen again this year for like maybe 2, maybe 3 of these tight ends. But who's that going to be? There's a lot of them that are going late, and a lot of them sort of fit a profile that's kind of attractive. So your odds still aren't that good, trying to pinpoint that player because there's a lot of them that are being drafted late that you can make an argument for. Whereas with the early guys, that they're generally going to produce for you.
We got another pass catcher here, another Jag. We talked about Brian Thomas Jr. last week. This week, you want to talk about the new Jag down from Buffalo, Gabe Davis.
Yeah, I think that Davis is just underpriced by about a round right now, which is crazy to say because Gabe Davis has not really proven to be like this like significant, 100+ target type wide receiver. But he does do what we want wide receivers to do in this format, which is, be a deep threat, big play receiver, be able to give you those spiked weeks. He's kind of like an arbitrage off of Rashid Shaheed, who I like a lot. Like I think Shaheed is a value himself. He had a lot of spiked weeks last year, and that's just the game that he plays. And then now, there's even less competition, you could argue, in that New Orleans offense. But, with Davis, it's sort of, I'm investing in Jacksonville's offense. I think there's a lot to like there. Trevor Lawrence last year, we've all seen the videos at this point of the unfortunate touchdown luck that he had last season, and all the drop passes that he had to endure, but also like his yards per attempt was the best of his career last year. Like he's technically getting better from an efficiency standpoint. We know that the talent profile has been there for Lawrence, and you look at the offense, it's just a fairly easily stackable offense, right? Like you could get their number 1 running back in the 4th or 5th round. You can then get Christian Kirk if you wanted to as well. And then, I like Brian Thomas a lot in the 6th and 7th, and he's slipping at times too. Like you can get him in the mid 7th sometimes. And then, Gabe Davis late. And so it's really just a play on the fact that he's a big play receiver, and also just investing in this Jacksonville offense seems to make sense because we know that there is some decent talent there. We just haven't seen it all come to fruition yet. And also it's being reflected in cost. So I'll buy into that.
Yeah, the Trevor Lawrence discourse is a bit nuts right now. First of all, every quarterback that comes up for a contract and is not horrible just gets that deal, right? They just get the next highest deal. That's how this works. And we can just throw the Urban Meyer year out, guys. Okay. There was a head coach in the NFL that didn't know who 99 on the Rams was. Okay. We can just punt that season and look at recently what happens when he's with a guy with a brain in Doug Peterson, and Lawrence is good. Yeah. Lawrence is a good player.
He's at least had his moments, and there were definitely times last year where you're like, this guy is not it, right? Like he's been inconsistent, but I do, it's not like we're pricing Trevor Lawrence by name, in the top 8 quarterbacks or anything like that. To me, going back to the episode I did on the pocket passer trap on the late round podcast, like to me, he's one of those high end QB2s who I don't think, and this is going to sound crazy, but we see it all the time where if you get 2 of those high end QB2s, right? You could get a Trevor Lawrence and a Tua, and you pair them together, the odds of them giving you a high end QB1 season because of touchdown variance and touchdown rate just going in their favor is better than getting that season from a CJ Stroud, a pocket passer that's going in the earlier rounds, in the round 5 range for Stroud. So I think he's part of that group where
you can, and like I would even extend that to like a Matthew Stafford, maybe that far, like into that like QB 18, QB 19 range, where those players, just need a little touchdown luck in order to really catapult themselves and be, usable pieces week in and week out. I don't see why Trevor Lawrence can't be that player this year. Do I think it's going to happen? No, because odds statistically, it happens like 20% of the time with those players, right? Like it's not that, even less arguably. And so, I don't think it's like a likely thing, but if you pair him with another quarterback late, you're able to, at least match that production that you think you're getting out of a pocket passer in the early rounds.
And unlike redraft, we don't have to pull the levers here in best ball to capture that touchdown variance. We have it built in because we get the week if he hits it. Last one, running back out west for the Denver Broncos. One of the first reels I made for you in the offseason was a lot of love for Jaleel McLaughlin, but you're drafting his running back mate as well, Javonte Williams.
Yeah, I want to just call this out. It's not that I'm like super, super overweight. I've just found myself drafting him more recently. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that I think this offense, typically you want to associate running backs with better offenses and, you want more scoring opportunities, all that good stuff. But in Denver, it's a little bit different because Sean Payton's system has favored running backs so much. I've used this statistic plenty on the show where of the top 20 running back target share seasons over the last decade plus, so since 2011, the top 20 of them, 8 of them have come from Sean Payton run teams, which is absolutely wild. The Broncos are coming off a season where they led the NFL in running back target share, and then you look at this team, they had Bo Nix, who will throw a lot of those intermediate and short passes. They don't have Jerry Jeudy anymore, which, say what you want about Jeudy, but he's at least more of a high floor talent that we know what we're getting more than a Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims. Now Cortland Sutton's still there. They have question marks at tight end right now because Greg Dulcich can't stay healthy. And so I do think we're going to see another season where these running backs are used at a really, really high rate through the air. Jaleel McLaughlin, I still think is a really good value. Like I still think McLaughlin is a good pick in any format. The difference is I don't think McLaughlin is ever going to be a true bell cow back. Like I don't think that's really in his range of outcomes. And realistically, I don't think Denver's going to see a bell cow back this year. Like I don't think that that's a probable outcome. But if there is a guy who's going to be that and do that, of the guys in their backfield, it's got to be Javonte Williams, right? Like he was the great prospect. He's shown it in the past that he can at least carry that workload. Now, you can argue that his efficiency was putrid last year in particular. I think a lot of that has to do with the injury that he was coming off. Now he's 2 years removed from that injury. That's good news. But he can catch passes out of the backfield. He can be the goal line back. And then they can ease in, this is last year in his contract too, but they can then ease in Audric Estime, who's more of an early down bruiser, use Jaleel McLaughlin as a pass catcher, and then maybe McLaughlin steals a little bit of early down work too. But if we're only looking at ceiling, and that's how we should probably be looking at these situations in best ball, I think Javonte Williams has that ceiling of any of those guys back there. You can get him past pick 100. Like you're not investing that much for a guy who has the talent profile, has the situation, even though it's kind of like a not obvious situation, but does have the situation, is in an ambiguous backfield. He does make some sense to me. And so I'm trying to be not like massively overweight, but I wouldn't mind being in like the 10, 11% exposure, I think, with Javonte Williams this year.
108.6 right now. I mean, this is the back-to-back that you're looking at when you reach the end of round 9, round 10. Javonte or Devin Singletary?
Right.
One guy is a great talent in an ambiguous backfield. The other guy is a middle-of-the-road jag, also an ambiguous backfield, but like that doesn't even seem like a choice to me. It seems way obvious.
Yeah. Like I've been going Javonte over Singletary. And look, there's nothing wrong with Singletary. I just think Singletary is probably better suited for a season-long format, 0 RB build, season-long format. Now, look, I play season-long still shooting for upside, but I'm only saying that from the perspective that you might want to play it a little safer, get some floor at the start of the season, whereas Javonte could realistically, at the start of the year, not see that big of a share of his backfield. Like it's a possibility. Whereas Devin Singletary, he's got to fight off Eric Gray and Tyrone Tracy. And like I like Tyrone Tracy as a dart throw, but let's be real here. That's not tough competition. So if you want that floor and that stability, that's fine. Go with Singletary. Just really hard to see where the ceiling is going to come from with a guy like Devin Singletary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, let's stop talking and let's get to our guest today. Mentioned it earlier. That's Pete Overzet,
one of the nicest, funniest guys in the fantasy football space. Love that guy. He does Ship Chasing, the Swolecast. He's done that for years. He does stuff for Fantasy Life. He's on Twitter at Peter Overzet. We talked about what's different in best ball drafts this year versus previous years. We talked about something that I haven't discussed on the show with other guests, which is managing exposure and talking about, where to be overweight. Is it important to be underweight on certain players? And then we do talk about elite tight ends some more, because I feel like I want to really drive this point home that I think tight end is going to be the one spot this year that can make or break a lot of teams. So without further ado, here's my interview with the one and only Pete Overzet. This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play best ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. That guide will then be emailed to you when it launches on July 1st. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. What's up, man? Good to see you. Good to see that smiling face of yours. Now on my this is my ship that we're on now. We're not on Ship Chasing. We're not doing any of your shows. We're on Becoming a Best Ball Bro this time around. I'm very excited for this.
I mean, I've been very excited that you've been dipping your toes in the Underdog streets. I know you've been playing for a while, but going full Best Ball Bro, I've been listening to every episode. I had to retweet the comment you made about rattling off the Week 17 matchups. I believe you said it was your brother. I was like, he made it. He has arrived. It's not becoming a Best Ball Bro. You are a Best Ball Bro now, JJ. Thank
you. Well, we'll see how the results go this year after doing so many drafts. But yeah, I mean, I said that to my brother last week when I was with him, and I sent him the clip that you had retweeted, and I texted it to him, and he's like, I still think that this is, and he's a semi-degenerate himself. He's very into sports betting and stuff like that. And so he should be someone who understands, the having the knowledge of Week 17 matchups, but he still thinks that I'm just a massive nerd for being able to just go game by game like that. Not only doing that in, August, September or something when football season's really, we're really excited for it, but in freaking June, this is not a time of year where we should be memorizing Week 17 matchups.
What's so funny too is I've noticed a lot of people, myself included, our brains are so broken that we're remembering matchups from last year. I saw someone posted a Waddle and Lamar Andrews team, and they were like, hey, Week 17 last year, chef's kiss, man. We still can't even get those matchups out of our head.
Yeah, that's hilarious. But you are doing a lot of drafts, man. What in your mind has been sort of the most difficult thing, sort of the most difficult hurdle this season that may not have popped up as much in the past?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately with my drafts. I'm 50 plus BBM drafts deep, so I feel like I have a pretty good lay of the land about how these are shaking out. And I was thinking about it compared to last year, where I thought strategically it kind of was a simple setup where it was a really good year for late round tight end. It was a really good year for late round quarterback. You had the Strouds, the Loves, and this isn't just revisionist history. People loved this rookie tight end class. People loved all of those late quarterback options. And then on top of that, we had the market continuing to push up wide receivers, and that created all of the favorable prices for the dead zone running backs. And so to me last year, it was you get wide receivers, grab a Breece Hall here, get some receivers, grab a James Cook or a Travis Etienne. And it was pretty straightforward. This year, I feel like there's so many values at each position in the early rounds where it's really hard to know, is this the draft I do the Josh Allen Kincaid or the Andrews Lamar? Is this the draft where I grab both Pacheco and Etienne because I think they're good values? And I think in any one draft, I feel comfortable. But from a portfolio standpoint, it's been tricky to be what is the biggest edge I want to push this year? And I've kind of defaulted to elite tight end, but then I see how little Isaiah Pacheco or Joe Mixon and I have. And I'm like, these guys could be absolute smashes. So it's just weighing like, there's lots of values. Which one am I going to prioritize the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, really being nimble too, right? And being reactive to what's going on in those early rounds. Because what I've noticed is like the way that things sort of set up in rounds 1 through 3, especially, you can start to build stacks even that early, right? Like if you want to go heavy Miami, if you're in the front half of the draft, you can go heavy Miami if you want to. Or if you want like, that Rams Cardinals stack going, you could get that hypothetically with like a McBride in round 4 or something like that, and maybe reaching for him slightly and start to get that correlation going. But then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can get Lamar and Andrews. Okay, that plan that I had, forget that plan. I'm getting this Raven stack and kind of going from there. And so I do feel that as well. It sort of plays into what you're saying, where like there's just a lot of different directions that you can go in. Where seemingly, I wasn't doing as much volume last year, but seemingly last year, it did appear as though there was more of this like blueprint to sort of follow and go through. Now it's just it seems like you can go in a lot of different directions. Yeah.
And I always try to approach it from like a humility based standpoint, like going back to the elite tight end thing. It's like, I think elite tight end's a pretty big edge, but then I start to think through some 2v2s, like an example, looking at the Pacheco blind spot. And I'm also really into Brock Bowers. And so I'm like, do I want every team to be a Mark Andrews and let's say a Jaylen Warren? Or do I want some teams to be an Isaiah Pacheco with Brock Bowers? And it's like, right. You don't want to be so overconfident on one side, even if you like it maybe 55, 60% more, just knowing that still 40, 45% of the time, that other side of the strategy can get there.
Yeah. And really what you're talking about here is exposure and managing that exposure. Are you aiming for certain exposure numbers for your early round guys versus your middle round players versus your late round players? Do you really care what your exposure numbers just generally look like, across the board? This is actually something, I've talked to a handful of best ball bros so far on the show. Haven't really dug into the exposure conversation that much. So how are you handling that?
Yeah, it's funny because, last year I streamed all 150 of my drafts and almost 2/3 of them were with guests of some sort. Mm-hmm. When I draft with guests, I like to defer to the people I'm drafting with. Sometimes I'll break a tie or we don't get it in time. But what happened because of that is I had naturally diversified portfolio because I draft with Pat. He wants to take James Cook in every draft. I draft with Sean and he wants to do something else. And so I had smoothed out exposures. And, some people thought that was weird. People want to go and get your stands. But the way I've kind of decided to approach drafts is like, I want to make the best possible team for that specific room. And sometimes that is going to involve a player take. I mentioned Brock Bowers earlier. He's a guy I like a lot. But a lot of times I'm going to have an elite tight end before him, and I'm not going to get to Brock Bowers. And so I think I'm pretty fluid with it. I will say this year, I was trying to be more heavy on my player takes early on and being like, hey, a guy like Jaden Daniels, he's at 120 when the contest opened. I had like 35% Jaden Daniels off the rip. Now I've kind of cooled off. I still mix him in, but I'm down to like 16 or 17% because I was like, I'm going to hammer these player takes early and then let drafts come to me later. So I'm trying to balance that of, having more player takes while also still being like, I think I can build really good teams with different types of players.
When you're trying to, get that the proper exposure for these players, are you okay with being overweight on certain guys that you have a good feeling will then, rise in price later in the offseason, especially with Best Ball Mania, where the contest itself isn't this short duration, where, I was talking to Herzig last week about some of these contests where we know it's going to fill in a week. And so differentiating, say, in round 1 and round 2, and maybe getting and reaching for a round 2 player to just have a slightly different lineup than everyone else, because the contest is going to close very quickly, as opposed to Best Ball Mania going on all summer. We're going to see ADP spikes and drops and guys getting hurt and all of these other things that we're not going to have with the mini Schnauzer, right? Like in these other contests, right? And so from that perspective, let's say, I'm drafting Waddle right now and lots of Waddle. Should I stop drafting Waddle because I'm trying to limit my exposure and be smart with my exposure? Or am I making this bet on Waddle and saying, hey, I think that he might be like an early second round pick by the time August rolls around?
For sure. And I do think that it's really nice to have those time box contests versus the BBM because you can approach things strategically. I've been thinking about that exact example you laid out as it pertains to Jonathan Brooks. Like, I really like Jonathan Brooks. I have 20% of him in Best Ball Mania, but I've recently started to take my foot off the gas, not because I'm not still bullish on him, but I'm telling you, when he opens up on the pup list for camp, the market's going to overreact and drop him around.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, if I keep hammering him now, and then I keep hammering him when he gets cheaper, I'm going to have like 40, 45, 50%. Exactly, right. And I'm like, I like him, but not that much more than the other backs going in his range. So I was like, you know what? I'll take my foot off the gas now, and I'll get my cheaper Jonathan Brooks when that happens. But on the flip side, say the puppy drops today, which I actually think it is, and that contest closes soon. It's like, all right, if Jonathan Brooks is one of my guys this year, go get him. Like, where his price moves in 2 weeks isn't going to matter if that contest closes in a week.
Right, exactly. And look, hey, I'm a Jonathan Brooks truther as well. We're gonna say that ADP is gonna rise because that man is gonna be healthy and he's gonna play and we're gonna love it. But no, I mean, like, it's a very, very real feeling overall. And
that's the thing too, in where you can get yourself in trouble. I don't know for a fact that he's going to open up on the camp pup, or it could be like you said. They could say, "Holy cow, he's back here at training camp and looking incredible," and it could slingshot the other direction, and then you regret, "Oh man, I wish I would have been taking more." But it is kind of trying to understand where the market is going, and I do feel confident in general that the market loves to kind of double count news things. Like, say Rashee Rice's ADP right now, this is me just doing like back of the napkin bro math. I would say the market is like baking in like a 7 to 8 game suspension right now. I think if Rashee Rice got hit with a 6 game suspension tomorrow, his ADP would drop a little bit. Because it just like the news happened.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And you're really weighing, like, you're really just weighing range of outcomes from an ADP perspective as opposed to just like a projection standpoint, right? Like, you're saying, like, I think that this player can't get any worse from an ADP standpoint. It's sort of like the way that I look at, like RB2s or backup running backs in the backfield, where like Zach Charbonnet right now, to me, is being drafted basically at his projection, right? Like, his projection might say, hey, he's RB 42, 43, and that's generally where he gets drafted. But there's obvious upside there where if Kenneth Walker gets hurt, then Charbonnet is probably if there were no Kenneth Walker, in Seattle's backfield, Charbonnet would probably be like a top 15-ish back, right, in fantasy football. And so the way that I sort of approach that then is, well, then Charbonnet is probably somewhat of a value because I don't think that things are going to get any worse for him in this environment, right? And you could probably, and you should probably approach it similarly when it comes to ADP and thinking about it the same way. Like Jalen Waddle, what are the ways that Waddle's ADP falls, right? Probably if he gets hurt, and that could happen to anyone, right? Whereas there's a little bit more, especially at running back. Like running back, there's just a lot of variation and stuff because we're going to hear reports about, teams wanting to use running backs in different ways. Then all of a sudden, Kamani Vidal goes from a round 14 guy to a round 18 guy or vice versa, just because, we hear something about like Gus Edwards and the way they want to deploy him, right? And so I do think that that's a good mindset to have is like, how are these players going to switch an ADP and think about range of outcomes in ADP as opposed to just the projection process.
For sure. And I mean, to me, that's the entire name of the game. Like a lot of the stuff that I've harped on, like with my videos and my live streams over the past few years, is all tilted toward the week 17 stuff. And I had the video, the week 17 is all that matters. And yes, that does mean in the literal sense with stacking up the week 17 games, but it also means 75% of this tournament is in the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17. The weeks 1 through 14 represents 25%, round 1 of 4 rounds in the tournament. And so to me, that lens is through a bunch of things. What are the type of players who see their production increase as the season goes along? Who are maybe guys who have cheaper prices because they don't project as well from a median standpoint? Like you said, the handcuff running back, maybe an injured guy who isn't going to have a great full season projection. And to me, I think one of the last remaining edges on underdog, and they are evaporating as the market gets so much sharper, is people still wanting to view this game through a 17-week lens and not understanding contingent upside, asymmetric bets. And I always think, like, through a very simple exercise, what would your teams look like if I told you you were only drafting weeks 15 through 17? Literally nothing else mattered. I bet your board would start to change. And it's not to say we still need to get there. We do, but so much of the importance is in those 3 weeks that I think that's what we really want to be leaning into.
Yeah, it's a really, really good outlook. So speaking of the environment in these best ball drafts, as you said, people are getting sharper. This year, we're seeing wide receivers go earlier than ever. Do you think as a result of that this is now a situation, an environment, a market where you could zig while others are zagging, or zag when others are zigging, however you, I don't, is there like a way that, like, are you on one of those sides if you're doing one of these things? But regardless, should you be going RB to start drafts? Because obviously people are going wide receiver heavy. There's plenty of, I've done plenty of research about like RB2s in fantasy football. That's sort of like the dead zone that exists in every single draft. It's just that your opportunity cost shifts, right? So like you go from, a home league where RB2s are going to fall off the board in like round 3 to RB2s now going, in best ball drafts in round 8. And it's like, okay, well, if the guy that I'm missing out on is Cortland Sutton, okay, that's not that big of a deal. Even if I'm drafting, an RB2 that's a typical like dead zone type back. But regardless, do you think that because of the way people are drafting these wide receivers, is this now an environment where going RB could be a winning strategy?
Yeah, and this is kind of the name of the game this year. I've even seen more tweets recently of people kind of logging in for their first drafts, and they're like, wait, what's going on? This wide receiver mania is crazy. Like, from a macro standpoint, I'm a big believer that you can make kind of any start work, because ultimately it's about spending draft capital at positions and understanding this dynamic of quantity or quality, not both. Do I think it's optimal to start your draft with 3 running backs this year? No. But do I think you could make a team that was smart in that way? Yes, where you take maybe 4 total, you take 10 wide receivers, and you're trying to get all of this upside to try to make up for your lack of quality at the high end. I think that's how I approach stuff. Even when people are quibbling about the elite tight end stuff, if you think Evan Ingram or Jake Ferguson is an elite tight end, I don't, but if you do, more power to you. Build structures around him like they're an elite tight end. Take Jake Ferguson and only 1 late, because you are saying he's elite. He is going to be a top 5 tight end. So that's kind of how I view all of this stuff. But I think it's really, really tricky, because if you think about when zero RB used to, be more rare and used to be really dominant, like Sean Siegel used to talk about being able to get 4 of the top 15 wide receivers in the league. And because everyone would start running back, you could get top 5 wide receivers in round 3, round 4. Now it's the opposite. Those guys all go in round 1, and lesser quality wide receivers are pushed up to rounds 3 and 4. So if you think about those 2v2s, if you're like, I'm starting Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, and then when I come back around, you're looking at, guys like DK Metcalf or Tank Dell. Not that those guys are bad picks, but when you flip those 2v2s and you're like, well, I'm starting with Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle, and then I'm grabbing Derrick Henry and Travis Etienne. Which of those 2v2s do you want to go to battle with? I mean, the wide receivers separate in such a big way. So I think you can play that game, but you got to be really, really careful that you're not just getting an awful side of a 2v2.
The other thing too, and I've talked about this a lot on the show as well, and I'm sure you've heard some of the discussion, but like people were like, oh, the round 2 sucks. Round 2, there's a lot of variation. We don't really know. Like, some of those wide receivers are going to naturally hit, but there are just a lot of those wide receivers, and we have a tough time generally ranking them. Like, it's not crazy to draft Nico Collins at the 1-2 turn if you really wanted to, or, the guys that are going at the 1-2 turn, like a Marvin Harrison Jr. or Drake London. Like, all of that makes plenty of sense. And so people are like, well, because round 2 is so bad, let's just go after running backs in round 2 instead. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of question marks at running back in round 2 also. Like, I think the difference with RB starts would be, and them being a little bit more appetizing, would be if there were Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson type talents and situations going in round 2, where, we get Saquon and we get Jonathan Taylor, but it's like, all right, well, we know that their pass catching upside might be a little bit capped. We know that their touchdown equity might be a little bit capped. And that's kind of frightening for a second round running back when you can like get that kind of player later. To your point, is there really that massive of a difference between Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor? I don't know. I think that Taylor should be ranked ahead of him and such, but I think that's another reason why it's a little bit more difficult to go RB. Like, it's theoretically, sure, let's zig while other people are zagging, but I don't know how applicable that would be this season. Would you agree with that?
100%. And it's also because the whole thing is like the market has now kind of shifted to being a zero RB friendly landscape. I mean, I remember when Pat Crane and I used to go out and do the high stakes drafts. This would have been like 2016, 17. And we're trying to pull off zero RB, because we were idealistic and all of this stuff.
Yeah,
and we're taking Darwin Thompson in like the 6th or 7th round because all the running backs are gone. And we're like, yeah, we got our 5 wide receivers, but they continue to take running backs. They continue to take it. And it was actually hard to pull off from that standpoint. Now it's the opposite. It's like we used to bag on Najee Harris because he went in round 3 and round 4 or round 1.
Exactly.
Now you can get him in round 8. It's like, I'm not bagging on Najee. He's an awesome pick. I get to start 5 wide receivers, grab an elite tight end, and still get Najee. And so the market lends itself to approaching drafts that way. I think it's like the dominant strategy. And so if you're going to swim against that current, you have to do it in a really thoughtful way.
Yeah, look, that's something that Sean's preached through the years with zero RB, where people are like, well, what? Because I remember like when I did late round quarterback, and that was this big strategy that people were talking about, everyone was like, well, what if everyone in your league goes late round quarterback? And I'm like, well, you adjust, because this is really just a value game. It's not just about a game of chicken and drafting quarterbacks late, right? And so, but with zero RB, and Sean's talked about this plenty, yes, there could be falling running back values, but if those like high-end running backs, which we see in drafts right now, like even, Devon Achane, who we know has a very, very high weekly ceiling, and, Taylor and Barkley and even Derrick Henry to some degree, like those guys are still getting drafted well above that next tier of running backs, from like just from a cost standpoint. And the thing that Sean's always preached is that if everyone goes zero RB, that's fine, because you're still able to get those falling running backs then as a result, because everyone is not drafting those running backs, and your team and your build, still looks optimal on paper. So, yeah, I mean, I think that people are, learning more and more and leaning into zero RB more and more. And it's funny because it's taken like 10 years for, people to realize the validity of the strategy, and it's taken best ball for them to really see it.
Yeah. And the thing too about it, if you think about like, I was thinking about this the other day about zero RB, where because the season is just so chaotic, and I realize this is kind of like a fundamental tenet of zero RB, but I think if you think about it through a very literal lens, it helps. It's like there's so much chaos. Like if you got to pick for which 2 running backs, like say everything was equal and you were like, they were each going to get 8 games. Which one would you want? You would want the one that was going to go second, because like the chaos of the season, the injuries, them getting wear and tear on the tires, like they're going to use up all of their juice early on. And you're going to want that late season guy, the fresh legs. And that typically is rookies, but it's typically the handcuff running back. And so you're getting like a double whammy. You're not investing in the guy who's getting all the wear and tear early in the season when it doesn't matter as much. It's easier to sneak teams into the playoffs. Then you're getting the much cheaper guy with fresh legs, who's generally younger, coming on when it actually lines up with how these tournament structures work. So it is such a dominant strategy for just the way these tournaments are constructed.
Yeah, makes plenty of sense. I asked Herzig this last week, but because you're going zero RB in a lot of these drafts, obviously I'm going zero RB in a lot of these drafts. We have this giant cluster of running backs that sort of go in that RB 20 to RB 40 range, where you could make a case for a lot of them. And so I'll ask you, who are some of your go-tos in that range when you get to like, round 8-ish area in these best ball drafts?
Yeah, I have a few different pockets of the draft where I'm certainly targeting running backs. It's obviously that range you're talking about. My most drafted in that sort of range is Chase Brown, which I know is controversial. I've read some newsletters that don't have super nice things, some models that don't love.
Hey now, I've come around on Chase Brown in redraft. I am here for Chase Brown now, but earlier in the offseason, it was just a little caution. There was a little scariness to his year 2 profile.
Well, it's so funny you say that too. And we kind of had this conversation before on Ship Chasing about, and I have Chase Brown in Dynasty, and I am terrified about him in Dynasty. I'm actually trying to shop him around, but that's the beauty of best ball, where it's like Dynasty is a floor game. I think Karain has said that, where you're trying to mitigate the risk, whereas best ball is an upside game.
Exactly.
You take the swing on Chase Brown. If it doesn't work out, guess what? You have a bunch of other entries. And if it hits, Well, I think it could hit in a way. I'm starting to float this take out, JJ. My take is that Zach Moss and Chase Brown could be this year's Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane.
Oh, like that? Oh, you went there. I thought you were gonna go like a Gibbs Montgomery kind of situation, but you went to Mostert and Achane there.
So I guess the reason I wouldn't do the Gibbs is because Gibbs and Montgomery were still relatively expensive.
Yeah, cost standpoint
last year.
Makes sense.
But just basically being like, we know this offense is going to support a ton of running back production. Like Joe Mixon hasn't even been good as a rusher, and he has produced tons of fantasy points. I think Zach Moss probably a better interior rusher than Joe Mixon. I think Chase Brown far more explosive. And if this backfield just condenses around these two guys, I think it could just be a fantasy explosion. And I've been taking way more Chase Brown, but I'm really trying to get as much Zach Moss as possible. And I put them both on the same team the other day in a slow draft, and I didn't even hate how that turned out.
Yeah, you know what's funny? So I've done so much work on like ambiguous backfields and stuff throughout the years, and I'm putting my draft guide together right now. And in that guide, I'm looking at middle round running backs, which are defined as running backs being drafted after RB2. So it's RB25 to RB42 is basically what I'm defining as middle round running backs. And if you look at their career year and then the hit rates of those players, the best years are, it seems odd, but I do think there's some logic to it. The best years are year 2. So that's, Chase Brown types. But and we've known that for a really long time, that if you can get year 2 running backs, year 2 players, they're usually pretty good bets to like exceed average draft position expectation. The other one is year 5, oddly. And I'm like, why is this happening? Why would year 5 be a thing? At first, I'm like, okay, rookie contracts are up. Maybe they're switching teams. And that's why, they get this like jolt, and they're getting more work on these new teams. And if they're switching teams or going to a new environment and they're still being drafted in the middle rounds, then that means that people might be a little bit cautious just because they don't know what they're going to look like on those teams, but they're going to see enough work. And that's why they're, being drafted still in the middle rounds, not the late rounds. But I think the bigger point, because there's not that many guys that did switch teams that are sort of part of that cohort. I think the bigger point is age apex. Right, is the fact that like when you're in year 5, like we've seen so many studies that when you're around that or age 27 season, that's when guys really do well and blow up. And so I was going through that and I'm like, okay, well, this is really helpful for like, the Tennessee backfield, for instance, where I've preferred Tajay Spears to Tony Pollard, just as like, not straight up necessarily, but from a cost perspective, although that's been shrinking over the last like few weeks. But I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, I guess this isn't going to help us for Cincinnati because Zach Moss is in year 5 and Chase Brown is in year 2. But I'm with you, man. Like that backfield just seems like we're going to see a lot of production. And if that production is going to sort of be funneled to those two guys, and why can't Chase Brown in, like you said earlier, in that environment where you're trying to win individual weeks, why can't Zach Moss get hurt for 1 week? It's not like Cincinnati's going to go out and sign someone and give him the bulk of the work. I mean, Chase Brown in that one singular, they might not want Chase Brown to be the bell cow for 17 games because he's not necessarily that guy, but why can't they do it for a game or two? Or why can't they do it, in these like individual pockets if Zach Moss were to be sidelined? So I'm with you. I've been buying into Chase Brown a lot more. Let me ask you this. This isn't on the show sheet or anything, but I talked about it last week a little bit. When you're like building these stacks and then you're looking for these running backs in this range, do you ever, like, let's say that you get, Jacksonville's one that, or the Jacksonville Tennessee game is one that I always go to with this because I do prefer Tajay Spears more at cost than Tony Pollard. It's not by like this tremendous amount. I think they're both just kind of interchangeable and Spears is just cheaper. But Tony Pollard is always sitting there at that ADP where I'm getting like, maybe a Kirk or like someone in the Jacksonville offense. And so, Brian Thomas, for some reason, I was just blanking. And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, do I force the issue with Tony Pollard and risk not getting, or because I would risk not getting one of those running backs, one of those bringbacks. And so as a result, have you found yourself like being naturally more exposed to the RB1s on those teams because of the stacking issue?
Yeah, that's a tough one too. It was funny because I was reviewing my portfolio. I wrote a piece up on Fantasy Life because they have a Best Ball Hub, a free tool where you can kind of upload your CSV and you can look at your Week 17 stacks. And I was looking at my ones for Caleb Williams and I was seeing which Seahawks I had coming back. And I kind of actually liked how smoothed out it was. I had some nice mix and match. And then I was like, wait, I have no Tyler Lockett. He was the one I had. And I was like, Tyler Lockett goes in the exact same spot of the draft as Caleb Williams.
Exactly.
It's hard to collect Caleb Williams and Tyler Lockett together. And so you do realize some of those blind spots. And to your point, you're like, yeah, I'm going to want Tony Pollard as a bring back on some of these, or I'm going to want Tajay Spears or maybe one of those earlier wide receivers. So I do think that's something that is helpful about reviewing your exposures and your teams, is making sure you're not falling into the same version of a team. And this goes back to kind of the diversifying too, where some people are like, well, just take a player stand, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, the whole point of like a bring back is you're playing that game to shoot out. None of us have confidence that it's going to be Tajay Spears and it's not Tony Pollard or Calvin Ridley. It's like, no, once you've made that bet, you just want that game to go bonkers. And at that point, I'm like, yeah, I want to mix and match my bring backs here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, would you, in that environment, in that situation, if you had like, this is a selfish question because I need to know what the heck to do to not have I want the proper exposures to these guys that I want in my being as to who I think is the better value, right?
Yeah.
And so would you, in that situation, ever say, like, if you had Pollard and Spears as interchangeable, I have no idea what your takes on those individual guys, but let's just say that they're just interchangeable. Would you then be open to just reaching for Tajay Spears and drafting him over a Tony Pollard? Or are you going to wait and just do your volume of drafts and do a lot of them and say, eventually I'm going to get enough Tajay Spears in these Jacksonville environments where I feel okay about it?
Yes, I think probably more to the latter, but I would want to, if you like Spears more than Pollard in a vacuum, I think I'm there with you. And it's getting even a little harder because now Pollard's falling and Spears is up.
Exactly.
Where it's like Pollard's available at like 105 and Spears' ADP is up to like 112. So it's like you are essentially just picking your favorite. I think, and this is obviously just getting so in the weeds about like frequencies and stuff, but I do think it's like, if you prefer Tajay Spears like at a 7-3 clip to Pollard, then like, yeah, go after that. Like be there. And then what I like to kind of do is use the ADP values to kind of balance me out, where it's like sometimes you're on the side of the board and Pollard falls another round or whatever. And you're like, all right, this is my time to get my Pollard share. But I think because the way I think about correlation, it is a tiebreaker for me. It's like you have these two players very similar, and now I'm going to boost up the correlation. But if you're saying I have Spears significantly higher than Pollard or a meaningful amount, and I'm getting the correlation, then it's like, don't take the lesser player in that situation.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Are there any other running backs in that range you wanted to bring up and talk about, or is it just Chase Brown and log out?
No, Brooks is the other big guy. We talked about him. And then that pocket's obviously really nice. I select a lot of, Jalen Warren, Najee in that range too. And then there's that next pocket that's kind of the sweet spot for that next tier of rookie running backs. So like Marshawn Lloyd, Ray Davis, Jalen Wright. You can toss Kamani Vidal in there. I love that pocket of the board too. And one of my actual most drafted is the cheapest of that pocket in Bucky Irving. Another one maybe we could talk through because I know you're a big Rachaad White bull. But I just love that pocket for coming back and grabbing 1 to 2 more running backs.
Look, I'll be honest. I did not like Bucky Irving that much as a prospect. And I think that I've said it before on the show, I think this year's Rachaad White could end up being Rachaad White.
Yeah.
But I've drafted a decent amount of Bucky Irving to hedge a little bit. The other thing too is, in those like earlier rounds, maybe it's not early, but like that round 4 to 6 range where you see a lot of those running backs go, I'm not really forcing the issue with any running back because you don't have to. Like, it's more so that, that running backs will fall in some drafts, whereas wide receivers will not fall. And so I'm just letting whatever running back falls, that's the one that I get. So, I do think on paper, from a projection standpoint, a guy like White, a guy like Mixon, like that tier, that group, they all look pretty good on paper. Like Rachaad White in my projections looks like the RB8 or so in fantasy football, but understand that that's, I don't really draft off projections. I preach to not draft off of projections. And so I am hedging a little bit with a guy like Irving because you never know how teams want to deploy these guys at the end of the day. And, as much as I think that Rachaad White gets a lot of crap for, being an inefficient runner, and, I have like thoughts on that in general, I'm still open-minded to the fact and the idea that, this coaching staff could say, no, we want to use Bucky Irving in more of a two-headed backfield.
And the funny thing is too, I think within fantasy football culture, everything has to be so black and white. You're either in on this guy and then that means you're out on that guy. The beauty of drafting a bunch of best ball teams and thinking of it through a portfolio mindset is I actually think it's smart to be in on both of those guys, because if you have the take that I think this backfield is undervalued, either Rachaad White is massively undervalued as like an RB1 who should be going in the second round, which if he does what he did last year, that is the case. Right. Or you say, holy cow, Bucky Irving's like a 16th round pick. And if Rachaad White's a really fragile pick, it means Bucky's going to smash his ADP. So I want my portfolio to benefit from either of those scenarios. I just find it harder to do with the more expensive one in general. And I'm the same way with Ray Davis versus James Cook. I like James Cook more than Ray Davis, but it's also if I have a little uncertainty and there's a 10 round ADP gap, it makes it hard.
Yeah. I mean, straight up, I have way more Ray Davis right now than James Cook, like because of that. It's just a lot easier to just buy into sort of the unknown. And that's why, the price is where it's at, as opposed to getting more of the known entity. I also, specifically with James Cook, I don't know how like high the ceiling really necessarily would be just because, Josh Allen being there and stuff. But I love that pocket too. I'm glad that you called that out. So we talked a little bit about tight ends. We have this, these higher end tight ends. I don't know. Can we not? I saw Hayden Winks tweeting about how we need to stop calling some of these guys elite tight ends, and I will listen to Hayden in talking about them here. But we have higher end tight ends who are being drafted in sort of these like round 3 to round 6 pocket. I say round 3. That's usually like just Laporta, and most of the other guys will go in round 4 and then into round 5. And then Pitts, Kittle, they go in round 6. Who are your favorites out of that group? Because my stance has sort of been, not all these guys are going to hit, right? Because that's just how fantasy football works. But I do think that some of them are going to hit, and I would imagine that 1 or 2 of them could give us like that elite tight end season that they would be priced at a round 1-2 turn type price tag, right? Like a guy like what we've seen with like Kelsey historically. So are there any favorites for you in that group, or are you just trying to spread things out and get sort of equal exposure to them?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I am trying to spread things out. I have not done a great job of that. I have way more Mark Andrews than any of those guys, which partly I feel good about because he is my highest confidence bet. Like to me, you can talk about, okay, Laporta's priced up way higher than these other guys. Does he deserve to be? Travis Kelce, the age cliff concerns. We know guys like Kyle Pitts and George Kittle can have such a wide range of outcomes. Dalton Kincaid, we don't even really know if he's good yet. Like you can go down the line with all of these. Mark Andrews is the one guy where it's like, I feel like what I'm buying, I know what I'm getting. Yeah. We've seen what it looks like when he's a target hog. We see what it looks like, how many touchdowns he can score when this offense is humming. You get the correlation with Lamar Jackson. And so to me, he's just the comfiest of the clicks. It's like, I don't have to worry about him being good. I don't have to worry about the offense. Like what's the most I have to worry about? Him staying healthy? We have to worry about that with all these guys. So I gravitate to Andrews a ton in the 5th.
Yeah, I love the Andrews thought. I've gotten a ton of him as well. I think the one thing too with Andrews that if you want to play a little scared, or and it's not the right word to use because I'm not trying to accuse anyone of playing scared, but if you're worried in some way that something's going to happen to Andrews, he's like the only tight end where you're like, oh, his backup is really freaking good, and I could just throw the dart at Isaiah Likely, not in the same lineup, but just elsewhere to build that exposure up a little bit in case something were to happen with Andrews, to at least have some safety net there. But I'm with you. I think Andrews is pretty massively undervalued. I'm actually writing the tight end section right now for the draft guide and digging into the data a little bit more. And it's really crazy because if you look at Travis Kelce's output, and I'm looking at full PPR, I'm looking at more redraft related stuff, but it still, coincides to this. I feel like the tight end price tags are the way they are simply because Travis Kelce didn't really meet expectation last year. Like only because of Travis Kelce. Because Kelce's numbers, he was still in PPR, he was actually the tight end 1 in points per game last season, but he still, because this game is stupid, he still is looked at as a disappointment last year because he was being drafted so high. But what's interesting is where he gets drafted now, or where he's being ranked right now by Fantasy Pros experts and stuff like that. If he were to score the identical number of points last year on a points per game basis this year, he'd actually exceed ADP expectation. And so I think people are, when I'm looking at this, again, this is from a season long lens, but I do think it's transferable because if you look at what's going on in these best ball drafts, all of these tight ends are going in places where the opportunity cost really isn't that significant. Like 4th, 5th round guys. Yeah, of course we want, but there's also to me, a pretty clear drop off at wide receiver, like a tier drop at wide receiver, I should say, after you get out of those younger upside players and like a Tank or like a Zay or something like that if you're into them. And then you get into like some of the more questionable veterans like a McLaurin and, you get into, Hollywood Brown, or maybe you're into Xavier Worthy or Jaden Reed, what have you. It's just an easy pocket to just get those tight ends, right? Like I've had a very hard time, especially when I'm in the front half of drafts, not getting a McBride, an Andrews, a Kelsey when he falls. It's just really difficult to like not go that route because of the alternatives that are sitting there. Are you in the same boat?
I'm in the same boat, and that's why I've gotten it kind of what we opened the show with of I feel like I have some scary fades because I'm always taking a tight end in either late round 4 or early round 5. So my biggest portfolio holes are guys who go there. Like I don't have a ton of George Pickens because I'm always grabbing Trey McBride. I don't have a ton of Isaiah Pacheco because I'm always grabbing Dalton Kincaid. I don't, I'm scarily underexposed to CJ Stroud because for a while he was going in that range and I was always grabbing it. And so that's where I've really had to think through like, man, I love the elite tight end. But what's so nice about this year and having the different costs, Laporta round 3, those guys 4, 5, and then Kittle and Pitts in round 6 is like, all right, let's pump the brakes on some round 4, 5 guys, mix and match some Pachecos, and then come back, get a Pitts, come back and get a Kittle. And I have been trying to push it a little more on the Swolecast the other day. I was like, I got a really sick value on ETN in the 5th. And I was like, you know what? This will be a non-elite tight end draft for me. Then Kittle falls to the 7th. And I was like, just kidding. I'm grabbing Travis. I'm grabbing George Kittle. So I do kind of like that if you're a little patient and basically force the room to give you that value.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I've noticed a lot too, just doing a lot of drafts. This is kind of related, but kind of not. But it's like, you find you get Andrews maybe a little bit like a pick or two past ADP. You feel good about it because you feel comfortable with Andrews as your tight end, what have you. And then freaking Kyle Pitts falls like 12 or 13 picks past ADP. And then you feel uncomfortable. Like you don't want to really take the double tight end because like you'd rather not take on that opportunity cost and you'd rather just have the one elite tight end. And then you're losing out on that value. It's just one of those things where like, when you're drafting these players earlier in your draft, there's this domino effect that you should always be aware of, okay, just recognize if you draft Mark Andrews and you do get a value on a Kittle or a Pitts, in the following rounds, it's not necessarily optimal to then just take that falling value. That's something that Corain really harped on in the first interview that I did for this show, where I asked him where like, you get a quarterback early and you have, let's say you get Lamar Jackson early and you have the Cincinnati, you got like Jamar Chase and T Higgins on your team or something like that because Lamar fell to the 5th round and you just grabbed Lamar, but then Joe Burrow falls to, round 9 or like, 2 rounds past ADP. And it's like, do you draft Joe Burrow? And Corain's answer to that was basically like, you gotta just ignore it. You have to do what's optimal for your individual roster, but sometimes it's so freaking hard to do that, man. It's so hard sometimes.
It's so hard, and it's so hard in both directions because I've been kind of preaching that even when you have the 2 early guys, let's say Chase and Higgins, let's say Tua and Reek and Waddle, every bone in your body is screaming, lock up that stack, reach ahead, grab it at ADP. And yet on those condensed offenses where the quarterbacks don't have any mobility, no one else in the room wants them unstacked.
Right.
No one wants them. And so even though it says like, this team sucks if I don't get Tua, I love pushing it. I mean, I got Tua on a Reek and Waddle team at like 146 in a draft the other day, like 2.5 rounds past ADP. I was like, I will dare you guys to take him unstacked. And I looked at the HN team. He already had a quarterback early. And I was like, all right, is someone setting up a backdoor Jonnu Malik Washington? If they want to, go for it. But then you can build these super teams if you're patient. And so it's counterintuitive in both directions. You're like, huge ADP fall on this guy. And it's like, does that really help your team? And then you're like, I want this guy so bad. And it's like, no. You could sneak in another pick or two if you're patient.
Well, it's understanding the condensed target trees, right? And the target distributions. Like with Miami, like you said, it's going to 2 guys. Those are the only 2 guys that people really care about aside from HM, but as receivers. So that you'll be able to get a falling Tua. A guy like Jordan Love, it's a lot more difficult to get a falling Jordan Love because even if someone doesn't have Jaden Reed or Christian Watson in round 9 or round 10, someone can still get Jordan Love and get Romeo Dobbs and Dontavian Wicks and Luke Musgrave, right? Like the same exact thing happened to me where I drafted Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze yesterday. And I was like, okay, Caleb Williams is at least on my radar because I just got these 2 Chicago wide receivers. The team that drafted DJ Moore had drafted Dak Prescott and Jordan Love. And I knew there was no chance that team was going to go after Caleb Williams after getting those 2 quarterbacks. So I got Caleb Williams like 2.5 rounds after ADP in that draft because you can squeeze out that value a little bit more. So I think that's a really good call out. I know that we've sort of gone on a tangent here, but like it's a good call out, to look at the individual teams and those target trees and the target distribution to know whether or not people are going to end up, going with like a naked quarterback situation. And yeah, at times they're going to snipe you for absolutely no reason. And I've done my best I'm going to start meditating a little bit more to not tilt off the planet whenever that kind of thing happens.
Yeah, it's something, one, it's reps, right? It's really hard if you're just doing a couple of drafts because we all kind of know what a perfect draft looks like. And then when someone blows it up, it's like, are you serious? But when you do a ton of these, it's like anything in life. It's like when you have so many reps at something, it's like, that's not a big deal. There's another one. In the way I think about it, and I think you talked about this a little bit with Corain, and I know he thinks similarly about this, is like, in my perfect world, I would love to have like 4 double stacks on my underdog teams, a couple of wide receivers, a tight end, wide receiver, running back, whatever. I'm only going to draft 2 to 3 quarterbacks. That means there is going to be one of those stacks, probably 2, that don't have the quarterback. And so when I get sniped, it's like, okay, yeah, but that's going to be one of those stacks I have where I don't get it. And because people have the mental hang up of not wanting to have 2 players, 2 pass catchers without the quarterback, I actually think it's one of the biggest edges in drafts is getting as many stacks as possible, irregardless of the quarterback.
That's a really, really great, helpful, positive way of looking at those situations instead of, you drafting Drake London and Kyle Pitts, not getting Kirk Cousins and just wanting to throw your phone against the wall because, someone gets Cousins and just stacks him with like Darnell Mooney or something like that.
You can still throw your phone against the wall if why I throw my phone against the wall is just like, all right, here we go. We're doing either another Drake May or Bo Nix double stack. Like that's where I'm like, all right, I can make it work, but I'm like, I only have so many ways to make this work.
It's always a New England stack. It's always or a Broncos stack. Like it's just that, like, or sometimes a Carolina, but it's always just one of those teams where if you do get screwed and that you're gonna maybe a Giants stack every once in a while, like a Dimes, and just hoping that like he can do what he did a couple of years ago. But yeah, it's rough whenever that happens like late in your draft and you're not set up for it.
Yep.
All right, I got one more question for you.
Yeah.
You're doing so many live stream drafts. Number one, I think it's absolutely insane what you did last year with live streaming all those 150 drafts and doing it with a guest. And I've seen you, like, when I watch your live streams, I panic myself when the clock's getting down to 1 and you're trying to click the star right in time to get them in the queue. And then, most of the time you're able, you become a pro at getting that out there in time and putting the guy in the queue. But props to you for doing all of that. But I have to ask you, is doing a live stream while doing a fast draft more difficult or easier than doing a live stream? I guess it's not a live stream, but a live draft with a toddler running around.
Yeah, I will say on the toddler front, I've tried to, like, before having a kid, I would be the one, like, I heard you say when you were like, had to run to the grocery store or whatever, like I outrunning errands, like doing a draft, whatever, multitasking. Now having the kid, just knowing how much it like sucks me in. I don't really do fast drafts unless I'm at my computer, kind of either for content or later at night, not really doing any fast drafts on my phone other than like Cardio Club. So I sidestep that. It's funny because I've done so many live stream drafts. That's not the element that makes it hard. Like, I feel like I'm comfortable having done a ton of drafts, interacting with the chat. What makes it hard is people want to get into my draft rooms, and people who get into my draft rooms like to draft like me. This seems hard to believe for people who are logging in and are like, look at this ADP. Come check out like one of my draft rooms. Like Sean and I had to draft like Jalen McMillan in the 13th round yesterday. Because I'm dead serious, because we're like, let's grab these running back values. Next thing you know, everyone's taking wide receivers. So I sometimes have to be careful because I have a warped sense of some of these draft rooms where I'm like, no, it's even more wide receiver crazy than you think. And that makes it hard because it's like, man, every single player I like is not available to me here.
Yeah,
and then I end up having to grab guys that I wouldn't otherwise have to take.
So has dad life forced you to do way more slow drafts than you've done in the past? And this is actually I'm actually very curious about this because I found myself gravitating towards slow drafts because it's just easier for my everyday life, right, than doing the fast drafts because it's just harder to sit down and do things while you got a toddler and a 5-year-old running around. And so, but I feel like, do you think that there's like a disadvantage to doing slower drafts from like a, falling value standpoint? And because I feel like, like in live drafts and fast drafts, people are panicking more naturally, right? And so you might get values that way. But on the flip side, slow drafts, you're able to kind of take a step back, really look at the landscape more than you would in one of those fast drafts. So I guess it's sort of like a two-parter. Are you doing more slow drafts? And do you think that there's an advantage or a disadvantage in doing that?
I think so. One nice thing too, because we all have like our biases or like our anecdotal stuff. Both Mike Leone, who I know you know, and Michael Dubner have done some studies on how teams performed in BBM4, BBM3, slow draft, first fast drafts, and it's almost negligible, the difference. That's is good. In like the aggregate. I have seen and people have told me like the super late night drafts, like come late summer when casuals and people are coming home from the weekend, having a few drinks, like there are some wild things that happen in those drafts. I will absolutely believe people who say I can cherry pick the right times to draft and get really soft rooms. I will absolutely believe that. And you're not going to get that dynamic in a slow draft. I think the number one benefit of a slow draft is the volume. You can get down so much more volume doing a slow draft. And so if you want to do a ton, I would say, you're going to sacrifice not getting to do a few late at night at midnight with the drunkards coming home, but you're going to be able to get a lot down. Whereas if you are just cherry picking, if you were just hunting for the absolute most EV, wait up late at night here in late July and August for some of these rooms.
Dude, I feel the same way whenever I'm gaming with my buddies and like, we're sober on a Saturday night or something. We're playing Rocket League and then you just get the worst players on the planet that you're matching up with because they're clearly like coming home from the bar. They've been, drinking at a neighbor's place or something. It is anecdotal, but I think that there's a lot of validity to what you just said. So that's very, very good to note. But Pete, man, it was great to chat with you. That was a lot of fun. Let everyone know where they can find you. You're everywhere, all over YouTube, but where are you at?
Yeah, we'll have to get together. I want to have you on Best Ball Breakfast on Mondays. I do kind of a mega live stream. I draft with Pat Carrain, who's been on the show, Sean Siegel, who I know you've talked to on the Late Round podcast feed before. And then I've been kind of rotating a special guest coming through. So I'd love to have you on there. Yeah, and then a lot of my strategy videos I've been doing on the Deposit Kingdom YouTube channel. Those are more produced, have an editor, not just off the cuff stuff. Did make a video about the elite tight ends recently. And I also did a video on my 10 takeaways after 50 drafts, a lot of the topics we discussed here today. So those would be the two spots. And then I do a lot of writing over at Fantasy Life. Did a piece on my exposures. And like I said, I'll give a plug for that free best ball tool in the same way you can just ask for your CSV from Underdog. You can go upload that to the site and look at some of your week 17 bringbacks and see, do I have too much Tajay Spears and not enough Tony Pollard? But I don't even know if that sentence I'm allowed to say because there's never too much Tajay Spears in my world.
Yeah, there's never too much Tajay Spears. Yeah. Like I said, I appreciate you hopping on. Anyone who has not pre-ordered the Late Round Draft Guide, check it out, lateround.com. You can also sign up on Underdog and get that free guide. Make a deposit on Underdog, use promo code LATEROUND, and you will get that guide to your email inbox on July 1st. But on behalf of Pete and myself, thank you for tuning in.